Hi, everybody. Welcome to our talk tonight. I'm going to give folks a couple minutes to get into the room, but I just wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Ingru Chen, and we are having a really highly anticipated conversation tonight to talk about Yowshien Kuo and his solo exhibition, Frontier Romance, which is opening at Gray Shadows Art Gallery tomorrow, Friday, November 19th. So settle in. I hope everyone is excited for this conversation. I know we have people from all over the country, and this will be recorded, and we will have an opportunity to share this with folks who aren't able to join us today. So before I start, I wanted to give everyone a little bit of background on the gallery and on our program. As I said, my name is Ing, and I founded the gallery in December of 2020. So we're almost at our 1-year anniversary, and we're really excited to bring artists from all over the United States, all over the world, and even, and then obviously locally from Boston to our program. We're based in Brookline, Massachusetts, and we do have exhibitions, we have a mentorship program, we have an art shop, and so we are constantly engaging with new voices in the art world and connecting artists with curators such as Aleesa and with thought leaders in the field. So tonight we're going to be really lucky to have this opportunity to hear Yowshien Kuo right here. We're kind of doing a hybrid in real life Zoom talk with Aleesa, who is all the way out in California. And they are going to be having a conversation for over about the next 40 minutes or so. And we're going to be hearing about this new body of work that Yowshien has created specifically for this exhibition. So let me do a brief introduction of our two speakers tonight. And then I'm going to have Aleesa after that talk briefly about the program that she is building at the Cantor Arts Center. So first and foremost, Yowshien Kuo. Yowshien is an artist who was educated in the US and in Taiwan. He completed his MFA in 2014. Yowshien currently lives and works in St. Louis, Missouri. His work is positioned to expose wide audiences to the invisible world that exists behind systemic xenophobia and discrimination, and reveal the irony of seemingly innocuous realities faced by multicultural people, with a goal to humanize and advocate for compassion and empathy towards those who feel a constant sense of disassociation from the circumstances of daily life. Yowshien is a recipient of the 10th Great Rivers Biennial Art Award. As part of that prize, he will open an exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis in 2022, which we're very, very excited about. Congratulations, by the way. And Aleesa Pitchamarn Alexander is Assistant Curator of American Art at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University. With Marcy Kwan, she is a founding co-director of the Asian American Art Initiative, which seeks to make the Cantor and Stanford a leading academic and curatorial center for the study of Asian American and Asian diaspora artists. To this end, she has helped bring in more than 200 works of art by Asian American artists into the Cantor's collection. Aleesa came to the Cantor in 2018 after completing her tenure as a Jane and Morgan Whitney Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she received her PhD in art history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. So thank you so much, Aleesa, for joining us for this and for bringing your voice to the conversation. And before we bring it over to your talk with Yowshien, can you tell us about the initiative at the Cantor that you and Marcy Kwan have put together?
Oh, sure. Well, thanks, Ing. Thanks, Yowshien, for having me today. This is such a treat to be able to speak with you about this new amazing body of work. So the AAAI, as we call it over here, Marcy and I started working on it in earnest in late 2018, and then we publicly launched it earlier this year. And, you know, as you mentioned, we've been really building the collection. That's one of my primary aims, is to really build the premier collection of Asian American art in the country, which that doesn't there really isn't a place that does that. And I think that that's something that we can uniquely bring to the conversation. I think we're really well positioned in the Bay Area, and considering its long history with Asian immigration and Asian immigrant settlement here, that this is really a great place to hold an initiative like this. We have 3 amazing shows that are opening next year that serve as the physical launch of the AAAI. So this has all been kind of behind the scenes until next year, when we open first with our long-term installation of Ruth Asawa's Wall of Masks. It's the wall of masks, 233 of them that she hung on the exterior of her home in San Francisco. And they are cast from the faces of her friends and family members and community members. And we're installing that semi-permanently at the museum. And then my colleague is putting on a show called At Home on Stage, Asian American Representation in Photography and Film. Maggie Dethloff is curating that. And that will open in August. And then finally, I'm opening a big show called East of the Pacific, Making Histories of Asian American Art, that is opening at the end of September. And that is a collections-based show, really showing off these amazing acquisitions we've been able to make in the last couple of years, around 100 objects, a semi-historical survey of key moments in the history of Asian American art, and some wonderful donors and collaborators are in attendance tonight. I see that here. So it's we're in good company.
Thank you so much. And thank you for what you're doing. It's really important. It means a lot for someone like me who's worked in the museum world previously to this for so long, to have an initiative like this and see that you're really building something strong. So we will have an opportunity to ask Aleesa also more questions about this at the end. There will be about a 10-15-minute Q&A. So you can start to put questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. And also, if you're in the chat, just let us know where you're tuning in from. That would be really fun and interesting to know. But without further ado, I'm going to slide, and then Yowshien will slide this way, and they can start their talk. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. I will start sharing my screen then. All right. Hi, Yowshien. Hope you're doing well today. 3 hours ahead of me out there. I thought we'd start with the basics and talk a little bit about the title of your show, Frontier Romance, and what's the inspiration for that, and what are you sort of signaling or thinking about with that title?
There's this quote that I, can paraphrase decently.
Yeah.
It goes something like, the romance or hunting is love, right? Something simple like that, where when someone becomes so obsessed with something, it's like falling in love. And so this desire and obsession, becomes associated in the title Frontier with frontier signifying like, it works in the Western motif context, but it also applies to like the sense of colonial domination. At the same time, it can parallel things like exploration or discovery, which is what we anticipate, through an emotion like love, or becoming romantically attracted or having romantic desires towards something.
Yeah, I love, I think romance is a great word, and this concept of desire, which desire can be both a positive and negative force, right? Depending upon the motivation behind the desire. And I think that that's really present in your work.
Yeah, I like the title in that it can kind of bring about a sense of psychosis, to an individual.
Yeah, so let's start with, there's some basic, well, I don't want to call it basic, but there's some repeated motifs and iconography that show up in this body of work. And I'm happy to flip through the slides and talk about any individual work, or we can start here. But I want to talk about some of the motifs and images that you're implementing over and over again in this body of work. And if you can share the thinking behind them. I'm thinking, of course, of the lasso, the tethers, the dress, the kind of oculus that we're looking at, the celestial sky populated with all sorts of objects, elements like that.
Yeah, certainly. Most obviously, of course, is going to be the Western motifs that occur in each work. And in the frontier romance, along with the sort of strapped or sort of like Japanese shibari inspired imagery. Let's start with the Western motif, which is something that I'm using. Hold on one second, I have a prompt on the computer. Start my video.
Yeah, I lost you. Oh, there you go. Good, you're back.
Okay, am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Great. So let's start with the Western motif, which is at first most obvious. There's, I don't really have a particular attraction to, the Old West or even like Western cinema or anything of that nature. It's really a tool that's being used to sort of discuss the transition, I guess, from like European into American culture, as far as colonialism is concerned, and then this sort of distinct American cultural, iconography, I think, that's associated with it. Because one thing, as an Asian American, and I hear a lot of others speak about this, it's like, what does an Asian American look like, and how do we define our place, at least visually, through something, physical, through attire even. And that's something that is very conflicting and confusing, I think, for a lot of people who are Asian American or even multicultural. And so for me, it seems like this Western motif is an extremely useful vehicle to describe the nature of colonialism, and then, how it's affected nations such as the United States, and then the power of this country, and what sort of impact it makes on the global stage. So that's really the, reasoning for including these Western motifs. I mean, in addition to, as someone who likes to make things and as a painter, their imagery itself is naturally quite beautiful and decorative, in the sense that it's very fun to paint and very fun to see as well. And then they have this sort of shibari borrowed tethering to all the characters, which in this series, Frontier Romance, all the paintings feature this quality, such as this one here, where there's a sense of bondage. And that is, from my perspective, it was a way to show this sort of state of melancholia that, again, someone who identifies as multicultural might find themselves in. So it's almost like if you embrace something new, you often have to sacrifice something that exists. For me personally, I think of, things that I grew up with at my house that defined, my Asian side as opposed to my American side. And then this sort of sense of mourning and loss that accompanies sacrificing things that are part of who you are for reasons that are completely uncertain to you. It's almost like there hasn't been any dialogue or investigation or even faculties for anyone to sort of piece this language together or build some type of narrative that actually surrounds the psychological impact and therefore social impact of these multicultural individuals, which is why, again, both the Western motif and then this sort of scenes of bondage are being implemented. I'd also like to quickly note that with the bondage too, I think it's something that is, it's like many things, it's a little bit more accepted, but generally and traditionally a little bit tabooed in culture. And I really like that aspect of it, in the sense that those, usually people who participate, this is something that is a form of pleasure, in the sense of like psychological pleasure, where it actually makes you feel like you're in control of your surroundings. And at the same time, it's to help sort of build a bond, or an intimate bond, with potentially another person as well.
Sure. I love what you were saying about this paradox of assimilation, and taking on certain things means also sometimes abandoning something else, because we can't be and do and exhibit all things all the time. So there's always a kind of selection process that's happening when you're living your own life, and in terms of the things that you like, or the parts of yourself that you choose to embrace and make public. I think that's visualized so nicely here in a very subtle way, this idea of feeling sort of bound or feeling strapped in terms of making a choice between all of our sort of multiple selves. I just want to point out here that I love this detail of the incense in the haystack. I think that's such a beautiful detail, the way that you've kind of seamlessly woven all of these Asian or Asian American elements into the Western motif together. There's a kind of queering element too to your work in terms of the way that it is playing with gender. I think we see it here, and beyond the bondage, we see the wig. If you want to talk a little bit about the wig and that significance, which does show up not just in this work, but in this one as well. It's a motif that comes back.
Yeah, this large blonde wig. Again, it's sort of like this sense of costuming. And I feel like, you know, costume sometimes is by choice, even if it's coming from positive or negative influences. But, you know, in regards to like gender as well, that is something that seems like, in the language of painting, like I think of medieval art versus Renaissance art, in the sense that like in medieval art, you know, brutality is sort of shown as something undesirable. And it's not sort of covered up in any sort of way in which the body is presenting itself to be beautiful or desirable. And then in the Renaissance, they take things that are like very brutal, like themes of like rape and transformation without consent, and try to like beautify it in a way that makes us think that like art should be beautiful in that regard. Mm-hmm. And that desire is something that's beautiful regardless of the consequences or wherever those consequences are. And so this was something I was thinking about in terms of like presenting the gender of these individuals. And the way that I think about, you know, in an autobiographical sense, like gender within myself in terms of my associations to the emotions that I have versus what's expected of me. And, you know, and I like the wig aspect and how it sort of ties in where it's sort of androgynous, like this one sort of looks like an 80s hair metal band wig, yeah. Or like it could, you know, be a lot of it, I think of like Dolly Parton's hair as well is always like on my mind. And then even Dolly Parton as a character, I think, in sort of building this character that she has said to have built for herself as sort of a stage presence and what that represents. Yeah,
she's present in this image, sort of, right? I don't have the detail of it, but
that's a little mini picture of Dolly Parton, but the face has been edited out to have a generic Google Asian man face on there. So when you see it in detail up close, it's not her face, but it's sort of encapsulating everything that she is except for her biology, right?
Yeah, it makes me think of, I don't know if you ever did this as a child, but certainly some of us have, as a child, you cut out images from magazines of like famous people that you really admire, and you can like literally think about superimposing or cutting out and putting your own face on it, this desire to like want to become something else, right? Or to want to become the object of your own desire, right? And so that little detail of the superimposed generic Asian face on the Dolly Parton, I love that.
That's such an appropriate metaphor. You know, it's like, I think about that a lot in terms of how we come to terms with identity, like the teenager's bedroom, posters and how they decorate it. It's like we see ourselves fulfilling those roles in some way or another. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, and the way that these figures are dressed, it becomes like a kind of drag, right? So it's almost like a Western wear drag that these figures are wearing here. It's very, at least that's the way it appears to me. It's very sort of exaggerated. very colorful, and made like sort of interestingly erotic in the way that you've rendered them.
Yeah, I think that, bringing out the sort of sexiness of it is really quite important, because again, these characters are idealizing it in that way, in their minds, in this world that they live in, that it is just so unbearably desirable. It's like tantalizing to the point where I think in order for that to communicate, it has to be sort of presented in like glitter and bright colors and sort of sexy cuts, like in this case with the chaps, sort of like we get the indication that it's sort of cut open at the crotch area,
Yeah.
like exposes the shin or the upper ankle, those little decisions, I think, culminate to what I want, viewers to experience from the psychological experience of these figures.
Where did you, I mean, you mentioned before that this is, the use of the Western motif is kind of a tool, but when did you first begin becoming interested in this type of theme, or do you have any kind of encounters with this type of imagery that are really significant to you that you remember, or how did this come about, essentially?
I think, this is a theme that we see a lot with many artists working today and relatively recently within the last few years. And I think, for me as someone who like really is excited by history, I don't feel it's coincidence. For me personally, it's came from like the 2016 election and this sort of rise of like Trump acolytes in the United States, and seeing that culture thrive essentially. And then of course, experiencing the repercussions of it, not only on television and social media, but personally in my day-to-day life as well. That really sort of made me, like many people, I think, re-examine where all this comes from. And for me, a lot of things were already dating back to the late 19th century, with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and therefore the Western period, or the Old West, where a lot of these ideals were starting to solidify, especially, in this case with connotations towards the Asian body of sort of being the dog eater or the rat eater, or, the person who is emasculated, in the sense that, you're not to fornicate with anyone on this soil. Your wives, your children can't come over, so you're not reproducing, in the sense of like, treating Asian people like vermin, right? Like an infestation. Yeah.
I think that connection that you're making is a really important one, because the West is the place where the Chinese Exclusion Act was really sort of born, and it came out of here, of this region, and it was the first race-based exclusion act enacted in the United States against specifically Chinese Americans out here in the West and in California. And so we don't think about that, when we're looking at these so-called images of like manifest destiny or Western expansion. And so much of late 19th century painting is isolated figures or no figures inside of the landscape, and that is part of the tradition. And we are just eliminating the indigenous presence, right? We're eliminating the presence of laborers or those who are actually building this country. There's an emphasis on the kind of pristine natural beauty of the American West, and so placing these figures in dialogue in such a way, I think, is it's an important and interesting contribution and connection that you're making between histories that are kind of obvious to me, in part because of where I'm located and the types of topics that I'm interested in, but like maybe is not super obvious to where you are out in Missouri currently. I don't know what the conversations are like out there in terms of Asian American presence in the United States and whatnot.
Yeah, in St. Louis, it's, very minimal, as there's a very small Asian population. So most of it is going to be, for me personally, through social media and news outlets that can connect me elsewhere. But, at least really quickly, regionally speaking, about being based and living in St. Louis, I think what a lot of strong artists are doing are responding to the history of a city like that, which has been extremely segregated as far as redlining and how infrastructure is developed and socioeconomics is divided, specifically through education and opportunity. So, that is really the formula of America in itself, sort of in this microcosm of this little old French city. So it's kind of exciting to see that and be surrounded by a lot of intellectuals who have been examining that conversation for a long time.
That's great. And I'm glad that, that there are relevant conversations for you happening there. I do imagine it must be I know that art making can be a rather solitary activity anyways, but I wonder if that is a challenge for you, being without a sort of large Asian American presence, and that obviously being constantly on your mind in what you're thinking about through your work. It's something that I try not to take for granted living in the Bay Area, which is super Asian. And it's something that I really like about living here. And I realized that if I were to leave and to go to other parts of the United States, that's just not going to be the case in many areas.
I believe my experience as, in adolescence living between two countries in Taiwan and the United States has sort of prepared me to sort of feel generally isolated in general, because, as I recollect, my experience in Asia was that I was the American, and I wasn't accepted there. Either they know the way you walk and your mannerisms, and then vice versa, obviously in the United States as well. So, I think that has sort of prepped me to sort of be in the studio, as you mentioned, this sort of isolated practice a lot of times, especially as a painter, and not someone who's sort of working directly with the public to build work from. It's easy for me to get lost into sort of my own world of fantasy, which is why, I'm using these sort of fictional colors and exaggerations to really build that universe.
Yeah, and I don't want to make everything too autobiographical, but I would love to hear a little bit more about your sort of trans-Pacific childhood and growing up, and how you think that that's impacted like what you've been interested in art-wise, or the types of things you're interested in your work, and if you'd be willing to sort of share more about your growing up.
Yeah, definitely. I can certainly say that I don't remember much from my education in the United States, but I remember a great deal. My education in Taiwan, which included, calligraphy and Chinese watercolor, life drawing, even abacus. I remember taking an abacus class, just the old calculator with the beads. And I almost remember nothing from the United States. But the weird thing is that I also remember missing my life in the United States when I was in Taiwan and thinking that that was the superior one at that time, which is very bizarre. It's almost like I did have this lust for America, even though I was actually kind of worse off. Like I was, felt very alienated there because of my dark hair and almond eyes. Whereas in Taiwan, everyone looked like me, and, I generally could fit in pretty well. And I loved my education, apparently, because that's all I remember.
So much for the American education system,
Yeah, and but the weird thing is, I still really felt that America was like the place to be. Like that was the cool place. That was what was desired. And I feel like that must have just come from like the power that it has in the way that it's so historically systemically built itself up in certain regards. And and I was really feeling like white adjacent. Like I didn't see myself as an Asian person. I only felt I felt white when I was in Taiwan in the way that people saw me on the inside. And then I was shocked when people didn't treat me that way in the United States, and almost inarticulate to know how to handle those things emotionally until recent years of discovering that it's, not just some form again of like psychosis that I'm experiencing, but it actually is like a very real and okay thing to sort of be proud and identify as like a multicultural individual. I didn't have to abandon all that was, right? Like I think many people in my generation, I was born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s. I hear this, a lot with like Asian American podcasters and TV stars and things, of sort of talking about like, the lunchroom of like not wanting to bring chopsticks.
Oh my God, such a same conversation. I hear it all the time, right? It's like we had the stinky lunches, right? We didn't want to have
lunch,
our lunches.
Yeah, and just being ridiculed for that, and then being totally convinced at a young age, being so easy to manipulate at that time, of thinking that like, like Chinese people are like super whack, right? Like this is not for me. I just like want to be cool and eat McDonald's.
Yeah, it's so funny. I had such because I also spent part of my life not in the United States growing up. I was born in Bangkok, and we lived in British Columbia, and I spent some school years in Bangkok, and I moved to the United States when I was 12. And I remember having a totally different response to you. I really didn't want to leave Bangkok. I thought Bangkok was like amazing. And I went to this great international school, and I had friends from all over the place. And I did not have those associations with the United States. And I think it is something to do with the way that my family spoke about the United States. And then when we moved to Oregon, it was just so, you can imagine, like a normal sized town in Oregon compared to Bangkok was rather anticlimactic and like not super exciting. And I was quite disappointed to come here. And I was like, what is all this hype about? Like, what is this about? This is America. This is nothing compared to like what I had access to living in Bangkok. And so, I mean, I only bring it up because I like to think about like, why is it, both of us are interested in this idea of America as subject matter, right? As a place of study, as an object of study. You're clearly thinking about the history of the United States, the history of landscape painting, the history of representation. And I'm thinking about those things too from a different perspective. But both of us have different experiences in terms of not fully being from this place and coming to it later, if that makes sense.
Yeah, precisely. It's so fascinating, and then even to expand, like something I wanted to mention was this notion, I guess, in the history of like painting and Western painting, since the 18th and 19th century, of like manifest destiny painting, which is that I think about quite often, and is a type of painting that I looked at a lot as a student.
Let's take a look. Let's go back to looking at paintings and talk us through this painting a little bit more, because it's one of the only ones that prominently features two characters interacting. So tell us what's going on here.
Certainly. So of course I have my own interpretations, but the paintings are designed so that there are breadcrumbs everywhere to the point where you can sort of build your own narrative from it. But the way that I enter into this painting is that you have this figure emanating from the sky. In previous conversations, I mentioned that this was sort of like a Baroque style painting, in the sense that you're witnessing a moment in time of transition, or like a happening, if you will. And we have this figure on their knees where they have, they're, in my mind, again, they've sort of fully committed at this point to this transformation, but they still hold doubt, in the sense that they're holding this keychain with like a lucky rabbit's foot, which I think, if you have a lucky rabbit's foot, it means that you have some doubt, because you don't think potentially everything's going to work out in the way that you anticipate. But at the same time, they're sort of surrendering to it. But then you have this figure sort of emanating from the sky, coming to them, surrounded by flaming joss paper, and joss paper is a type of
detail. Yeah.
Yeah, currency used that's burned to give monetary funds to your ancestors in the afterlife, and a lot of Asian cultures, or East Asian cultures specifically. So it's almost like this person is coming back from the dead, or visiting this person to sort of give them a warning or indication that they may not be pursuing the right path, in the sense that they're abandoning everything that they are in favor of this sort of clouded desire or lust that they have, right? This frontier romance. But they're sort of dressed up in the Western regalia as well. But there's secrets, like within the painting, like his bolo tie piece is actually a piece of jade.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're always sort of holding on to some part of them that makes them Asian or diverse as an American, or as like a Westerner in this case, as there's, even when they transform and commit, they're still kind of holding a piece, in the sense that with the figure who is on the ground, there is a strand of black hair that emanates out from the blonde wig.
Yeah.
On the right side.
Little piece.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like not fully costumed, or we're sort of seeing behind the curtain of what's happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing the edges of it, right? You know, the things that you're not supposed to see, the frayed edges, essentially.
Yeah, precisely. And then there's like the jade bracelet that has fallen to the ground near the character's foot in favor of the lucky rabbit's foot. So they sort of switched totems in a sense. And then the boots, like I love the boots in the sense that it, you know, did they belong to the figure who is not, who doesn't have the shoes on above them, or what's going on there? I like the sort of ambiguity and using them again as like a symbol. And they're so powerful in their appearance in the painting. They almost seem like figurative and like a character in itself. It could exist on their own.
I love how the figures often, they look like, depending on your perspective, they could be like either ascending or descending, right? So they're either kind of falling through something, or they're ascending through something. And, you know, what is in all of these paintings is this kind of celestial sky plane. And it looks like, you know, here almost there's like, it's like a hole ripped into the fabric of something, right? And exposing the sky.
Yeah, and that's again a way just to sort of like turn the universe and rotate around, almost like a camera that's sort of just moving around the space. Well, you know, my thinking was like, if I was sort of like a avatar in the metaverse, right, in this world, and I was sort of like looking around, how would it sort of be designed? And what types of things would we see? And so I like using the constellation or the universe up there, because it sort of talks about, I think, this cycle of like birth and death, and in almost like a memento mori type way. And usually within it, in these paintings, there's like, in this one, for instance, below the figure, it's a glossy surface with stars and glitter and things like that, but there's also animal bones.
Yeah.
Those bones, you know, most anatomical structures are similar from like ancient animals to current mammals and animals, but they were loosely based off like prehistoric animals. And there's sort of like flowers with hummingbirds that sort of fly around them upside down.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's hard, very hard to see in the images. So I like this notion that like everything that we understand of existence sort of exists there, but it also feels like, I think of like flowers and still lifes as something as like a timeless subject matter for us to look at, as far as, again, like a memento mori type item in still life painting. But then at the same time, it's something that sort of is always reinventing itself through every generation, in the same way that like we see the stars in the same set of stars that people saw, you know, thousands of years ago in the sky. And then like at the same time, I think it works as a anecdote to sort of belittle some of the concerns that exist, you know, in almost an ironic way that are existing in the paintings.
Let's see. And then this last great one, World Turned Upside Down. I want to make sure that there's a couple things I want to talk about at the end here, but let's say a little about this painting and this, one of the more complex paintings here, and the figure's positionality and all these figures that are in the periphery of the piece. Tell us more.
Yeah, so this one, the composition I think is very telling, and hopefully is fairly reminiscent of the experience of like an oculus and a lot of architectural structures, and then what the oculus sort of served as, right, traditionally in many cultures of, I think of course, like in Rome, the Parthenon, yes?
Or the Pantheon.
Pantheon, yes, I knew it was wrong what I was saying.
Okay.
Yeah, the Pantheon. And then again, I think of like James Turrell's pieces as well.
Yeah, they're amazing. I just thought you should go see the one at Mass MoCA since you're in Boston. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's tomorrow.
Good.
But this notion of the oculus, which hopefully, you can get with the gesture of the figure standing above and exposing their oculus. Of sort of poking fun at this notion as well, where, that this idea of, we have the snake above, which is obviously going to remind people of like the snake from the biblical tale in Genesis, and then also depicted throughout painting and its history in the West or in like European American cultures. But, I like this notion where we have this figure sort of playing with the notion of looking into the oculus as more like a void as opposed to something that's hopeful, which was like when I look at a James Turrell piece, I'm full of life, right? And this hopefully is sort of doing the opposite in the sense where it's sort of poking fun at the oculus of the history of like Western art and the stories that sort of come with it sometimes in terms of like, as mentioned earlier, glorifying rape or sort of masking brutality.
Right, exactly. And that is so much of what history painting is a kind of masking of brutality. I wanted to just highlight this recent show that closed earlier this year, all right, in St. Louis, and how this body of work differs and builds upon what was shown here. The imagery is a little bit different. Can you tell us, sort of quickly what you were dealing with here?
In this one, so this show, each of the pieces, the only through line that they share in common is sort of the notion of tackling the feeling of necessity to assimilate, and then the failure at that. So sort of being mocked at through your attempts, which is, I think the sad truth is that like I myself have been so bought into for so much of my life, that sense of mockery that I also mocked, people like trying to assimilate and seeing their failures through that in public spaces and things like that. I'd almost felt embarrassed for them. And so it was a response, a lot of these pieces, to that experience, to try to showcase how sad that can be. Like if I, were like a filmmaker and made a film based on those experiences, how would that look? So like in the image on the right, that one I can talk a little bit about is based off Caravaggio's Card Sharps painting. And so the colors are a little bit borrowed from that. But I sort of imagine like, what if this Asian guy like appeared and danced on the table and like sort of knocked the card game and like threw these people into a frenzy because of like the exoticness of this strange dancing figure who like appeared out of nowhere. And then I was like, oh, what better way to like show it than like a nude person riding a dolphin.
What better way? Of course.
Yeah, and then there's this thing like I feel like with the emasculating of Asian men that has been sort of historically present, of like having smooth bodies, the opposite of like a lumberjack, right?
Yeah. I think even Ali Wong has a joke about that.
Yeah, totally. You know, it's like having sex with a dolphin.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you think about like the dolphin culture, which is like full of rape as well, in their world. So
Didn't think about that part, but yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of weird things happening in the painting, but I just sort of thought of almost like this cartoon-like chaos, where the figure is like jumping in, like almost like a television host, excited to make the appearance, but then they're actually like making a fool of themselves or look foolish in the act of doing so, and they're the only ones who doesn't realize it, right?
Yeah.
And so everyone's like faces are melting off because of the sight that they're experiencing. And then the one on the left, really briefly too, is basically someone like setting up almost like a religious experience of like cutting open a dead carcass. But the carcass, if we see the painting up close, is like obviously very fake. And then also the opening looks like genitalia, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I want to talk briefly about, I know we're running out of time, but if you wanted to just speak briefly about some of your influences, and, offline, you and I had talked about a figure like Robert Colescott and the history of Black painters and Black figurative painting, and how that's affected your own practice.
Yeah, Colescott is a very important example to my work. What I love and am attracted to his work specifically is his use of history in response to the history of art. And then in a lot of ways, he's sort of building his own universe around those narratives, and creating sort of a new dialogue around it that I think is very accessible through sort of the upfront playfulness. But then upon closer examination, you notice that there's a lot of realities that are difficult to discuss and converse about at play in dialogue with each other in the works themselves, which is something that I strive for as well and find a deep commonality with. Thinking about a lot of sort of Black painters in America is really how I learned how I could use my interests in an effective way. They really have sort of set the primary example to sort of guide me and teach me, almost like mentors, of how to sort of build our experiences and our emotions and our thoughts into something that can be effective for audiences.
Yeah, it's interesting that you and I have that similar experience of, I was not trained in art history to study Asian American art, partially because that is just not really very accessible in graduate programs. And so my background is actually in the history of African American or Black art in this country. And I really feel like those artists and that history has so much to teach us about our own self-formation and collective formation, and how to think about our bodies and minds and space. And I've learned so much from them, and it's so interesting to see how you have as well. Last point, last couple of minutes is, I'm gonna skip that one to just talk about, because we barely talked about this, and this is such a huge thread in your work, and you did mention it briefly earlier, but this concept of Asian American masculinity, specifically here in the context of the West. I'm pulling up another piece from this year, Kenneth Ham's video installation, Silent Spikes, which also deals about the presence of Asian Americans and cowboys in the West. And if you could speak to just this broad concept of Asian American masculinity in like a minute.
Yeah, we mentioned it sort of briefly, at least historically, with sort of this late 1880s period and sort of the history in America of emasculating men and how that's sort of carried over continuously to the present day. Personally, I feel it's extremely exciting to see the work of like this piece by Martin Wong. And then of course, Kenneth Ham's Silent Spike's work is just so, I really love seeing the fact that we're all sort of responding to the same thing and finding a through line is extremely exciting to me. It brings me a lot of hope in that, our efforts are something that's even bigger than just, I think, even the iconography or any individual piece that we might be building upon. that there is so much to explore here that is just, rife with potential.
Yeah, I agree. It's amazing to see many artists addressing similar types of issues. It makes me feel like we're kind of all working on something together collectively, whether or not we really know it or it's on purpose. But, seeing the through lines between your work and Tam's work, for instance, it gives me hope that we're getting somewhere in terms of advancing nuanced conversations and broader conversations about issues that are relevant to all of us. So I'm going to stop here and open it up to Q&A. But thank you. There's so much more. We could go on, but I have to stop. That is my job.
Thank you so much, Aleesa and Yowshien. I hope everyone had as much fun as I had listening to the two of them speak. We have a few questions. So I just wanted to ask first, though, Aleesa and Yowshien, did the two of you ever imagine that we, as Asian Americans, would get to this point of having this institution focusing on collecting artists Asian American artists in this way? I mean, I've worked in Asian collection museums, which are very specific in that way, but what you're doing is building something in an encyclopedic space. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I certainly didn't expect it from either a professional or like personal perspective. Yowshien and I are around the same age, so we're like not that old, but like even still, I had such limited exposure to this type of material. And my experiences in graduate school and in undergrad, like I had never learned about the work of a single Asian American artist as an undergrad, and it took me well into graduate school. And it also wasn't something that I planned to work on because I think in part I didn't want to be the Asian American person working on Asian American topics, which I think a lot of people can relate to. But now I very much own it, and it is something I'm very invested in. But it is amazing to be in this moment, to work with young Asian American artists, Asian American gallerists, right? A gallery owner here, and myself, and we can all be in conversation together. If you would have told me when I was in graduate school that the art world that I would get to be a part of would be super Asian, I would be like, nah, that doesn't that doesn't check out. But we are in a different moment now. I want to think about it for the better. I don't want to think that it's just because of the recent violence against Asian Americans that's like the only reason that people care. I want to think it's more than that. And so I think that hopefully together we can keep this momentum going and make sure that everybody continues to care, as this, is important to us. And it is also important to, I'm always thinking about the students at Stanford too, that this is the direction that things have to go. So I don't know about either of your guys' experience in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, as a trained figurative painter, it was like the last thought I had was to paint an Asian body on canvas after being so absorbed and immersed in the history of painting. Yeah. It's almost like, I don't know, it was something I didn't imagine as a student that I would be doing. I thought if I was going to work in the figure, it was going to have to be primarily white figures on the surfaces. So certainly a dramatic change has been made for the better. And I also just want to mention too, I feel like with recent violence against Asian Americans in the news, I feel like that violence was always there.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And this is just to sort of piggyback off of what you're saying a little bit on the topic. It's just that, there is actually news coverage now. And still even today, as like an Asian American, what frustrates me most is that any sort of inclination I have where I'm experiencing some kind of discriminatory action and express that, it's still treated like hyperbole. And it's more than frustrating in the fact that I think that's the more frustrating part. It's like, if we're not going to be taken seriously, then how do you expect to address any sort of violence or change at all to begin with? And not just for Asian Americans, I think for anyone who's experiencing discriminatory rhetoric of that nature.
Yeah, and we all know that representations and like representation in art is not going to be like the only thing that saves us all, but it is something that I do still think is important in so many respects. And I think your paintings contribute in that way. I mean, a complicated way, not just, a kind of didactic, straightforward, look, I painted Asian Americans. Within them, there is so much complexity, as you've talked about. And expanded upon, but that is really what I'm looking for. And I think what we're all looking for is this increased nuance in conversation, right? The ways that we can think about ourselves as individuals and our individual stories that are often very different from each other, but also the things that matter to each of us, and how we can talk about those kind of shared issues together. And that's really why I think talking about your paintings makes for such a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity and your perspective on that side of it, where, I'm going into it where I don't want to just speak to an Asian audience through the work.
Right.
I'm really trying to see how we can build up these conversations through a sense of community at large, and expand into as much sort of diverse dialogue as possible.
I see we have a comment here from Lian Trong, who's an amazing artist who I've worked with before. And she has a question in here that I didn't get to talk about, but is great. And it's about the use of materials in your work, because if you look at the media line, it is not just paint on canvas, it's so many other things like bone ash and fiber and glitter and iridescent paint. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, as someone who loves to make paintings, I love the materiality and alchemy of paintings, especially seeing Rembrandts and Titians and works of that nature. But for me, it's really a way to actually manipulate the paints so that it kind of can create its own type of surface that's unique. It's almost like a signature surface. A lot of the paints that I'm building, I'm combining calcite with pigments and then various binders. In this case, because it's primarily acrylic, there'll be acrylic binders.
Mm-hmm.
But for those of you guys who are less familiar with the material, acrylic is basically just glue. So whatever colors you're putting in there, materials. So a lot of times, for instance, I use glass in high sheen areas because glass has a natural refractive property, which will refract the light differently on that part of the surface, which I think just makes the viewing experience, a little bit more tantalizing. And for me, as someone who enjoys those things, bone ash, I think it's exciting to sort of have the remnants of life, almost in the way that ceramicists like to work with clay and its history. So a lot of these materials, I think ceramicists are dealing with as well, or have in their studios for a lot of the same reasons that I'm using them.
Yeah, there's this gorgeous iridescence in a lot of the paintings, and we've been having fun whenever some of the light hits it during the day. I mean, if people have a chance to come to see the show in person, it closes December 24th. I really would encourage you to, because on the screen, you're going to see it in a very different way, to be honest. And we walked around the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum yesterday, and I loved seeing him nerd out on the Rembrandts, the Titians, and talking about how these painters created their pigments. And honestly, Yowshien knows a lot about this. And if you come through, there's the surface texture, like some of it is holographic actually, and then some of it is extremely matte. And even we had visitors today who aren't that familiar with painting, but that was one of the first things they noticed. So I think even just on a technical level, they're very different from just someone who's painting acrylic work. But we have a couple more minutes. There was one more comment or question from Ken Wemberg. Ken said, as has been pointed out, your paintings all have great little details. Are there any past details that stand out in your mind, or any favorites?
Ooh. I think not anything in particular. With the use of a lot of the Western motifs, again, flowers have different meanings. So a lot of times when I'm selecting a certain flower, it's for the specific meaning. So for instance, a lot of the flowers in this series of paintings are notoriously poisonous. So they're all toxic. Yeah. So, there's one where a figure's surrounded by poison ivy, but it's just painted to look pretty. And then white snake root is the name of one of the paintings, which is the name of one of the most toxic common plants there are in North America. And those are sort of surrounding the scene as well, along with a lot of poppy seed plants and opium plants to sort of narrate on the history of, more building upon hate for Chinese.
Oh, that's an interesting detail. I didn't realize that. That's so fascinating. How cool.
Yeah, I would hope that someone who knows their plants would discover that and find that. And then the
I knew plants. Oh my gosh, I love plants. I'm like, wow,
yeah.
this?
Because I was saying to Yowshien yesterday, it's almost like we need a glossary of the symbolism in these paintings.
Yeah.
In our group exhibition in January 2021, Yowshien had one work, and I knew this was amazing when I saw it because it had the chandelier from the Arnolfini wedding. And
cool.
you just think about the Arnolfini wedding and the loaded symbolism in that painting. I was so excited to see what would come of this because every little thing is intentional, I think.
Yeah, nothing is by accident. It has to have a reason, everything down to the text and tattoos that individuals have. The stars are also, if they're randomly painted, they're organized so they look random, but if they just look like stars, I mapped out all the constellations so you could find your zodiac signs.
Wow, really? Oh my gosh.
That's cool. Get over here.
I know, I so want to see them in person. I just know that the digital reproductions, because of their texture, because of your materials, that I am missing out, but hopefully soon enough, I can find a way to see them.
Well, and I hope the same for everybody. I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to put the show together. There's a lot more to discuss, and I think all of us, if we can make it to St. Louis in 2022 to see Yowshien's solo show at the Contemporary Art Museum, please make an effort to do that. Do you know when that will be in 2022?
It will be in September.
So we'll have a party. But anyway, in the meantime, I think we have to end it because it's about 8 o'clock and we're here 5 o'clock at Aleesa's time. We open the exhibition tomorrow morning. It starts at 11 and there's a reception at 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. So please come through. And then in the meantime, feel free to contact us if you have questions about the show and, follow Yowshien and Aleesa on Instagram as well. So thank you to everybody, and we'll send out a recording to those who registered. Have a great night.
Thank you. Have fun tomorrow. I'm there in spirit.
Thank you, Aleesa. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me about the work.
No, this was a delight. I wish I could be there tomorrow, but I'm sure it'll be great.
There'll be other opportunities.
Yes, exactly.
Take care. Thank you, everyone, for joining.